Okay, so now we have two short panels about the implication of blockchain technology on society. So it's kind of drawing on the talk of Lawrence Lessig. So we have now half an hour, and we want to discuss the future of decentralization from a technical perspective. The idea is to question ourselves with regards to, thanks to this new technology, towards what kind of society are we actually moving, right? So are we moving towards this more free and egalitarian, more participatory society, or are we moving more towards a more dystopian vision of society, the so-called Skynet, which is characterized by this kind of oppressive and totalitarian system that are self-executing, etc. But before we enter into discussing this, I think that it is important to mention that within this conference and those workshops, we actually try and think about the blockchain in a much more systematic way. And so before the conference, we had internal workshops. One of those working group of the workshop for the first time was the ethics workshop, which was about identifying what are the ethical challenges that we need to account for when we develop those technologies. So I would like to ask Ben if you could give a little overview of what we have been working on.
Yeah, hi. So I'm Ben Zevenbergen. I'm a lawyer at the Oxford Internet Institute. But I've been working on ethics recently, quite a bit. So what I kind of found is that, as a lawyer, if you're speaking to technologists, they don't take you quite seriously. They think you're conservative. They want to talk about ethics. So I've kind of rebranded myself as an ethicist. It's also been quite frustrating to apply laws to new technologies. As we've seen here in the last few days, trying to apply law to blockchain is pretty difficult. So, out of that frustration, I've been working on all sorts of internet technologies. And Primavera asked me to come here to work on the ethics of blockchain technologies. So we led a little workshop on Monday and Tuesday with a bunch of guys who are here as well. I think we had 6 core people working on this document. And what we're trying to do is to really understand the ethical implications of blockchains. So we got together. None of us knew that much about the technical side. So we had people like Henning and others come to our table, explain to us how the blockchain works. And we had several big sheets that we filled with loads and loads of Post-its, trying to inform each other what we thought of the different technical implications. And then we started to work on a document, and we were still working on the document. But the way we've structured it is that the first section talks about why ethics, why is it important. Technology isn't value neutral, so that's why. The second part is understanding, what are the ethical implications and the assumptions of engineers who are developing blockchain technologies and the applications that are built on top of this technology. And then a part of that is also to sort of explain how to think about these assumptions and implications. What does this mean for society? What does decentralization mean? What does disintermediation actually mean if you put it into a particular context? Which kind of factors do you actually need to think about? Then we have a part on explaining the tech ethics methodology, how to apply this to your particular technologies or how to apply this to developing the blockchain further. And the last part is about the governance. How can you, as a developer, work with governments or other legitimate authorities? And I think we're going to do the main work on this next week, and I think it should be published sometime early next year.
Thank you. So in this panel, I guess we have like a variety of people, mainly developers and architects of the technology or lawyers that are actually thinking about this. So I would like to ask everyone, mostly now that we all understood that technology or architecture actually can have an impact, and even though it is a general purpose technology, it does obviously influence the way in which we can either regulate it or it influences the way it is regulating individual actions. So currently, when we look at the current deployments of the blockchain technologies, what are the values? Like, can we try and extract what kind of values have been encoded into those technologies, or perhaps what are the values that we should really pay attention in order to try and encode into this technology, whether it's within the Bitcoin network, whether it's into Ethereum, or any other like future blockchain-based applications.
So I think the main thing that's encoded in all these blockchains is the value of like censorship resistance. The idea that it should be like hard for an adversary to compromise the system. And then we also see people make a lot of effort in the Bitcoin community to ensure privacy for Bitcoin users. So I guess those are like the main things that are like kind of we see today. But we see a lot of like people trying to build applications on Ethereum that are kind of socially motivated, that are trying to kind of produce some good for some group of people, maybe content producers, maybe people who need to coordinate in order to like organize events. I don't know, maybe someone else can think of some more examples.
Well, I mean, I think that's also helpful to kind of take a step back. I'm the philosopher more than the IT person, I guess. I'm not building a blockchain. But thinking about really the opportunity that's open, and I thought Lawrence Lissig's talk was excellent about this. I wouldn't call it wargaming because I don't like war so much. But the idea that we need to imagine and envision the future. And when you have to design a system, you have to imagine that future, right? And so many times now we have the opportunity when we're introducing these new digital technologies to rethink the way that we do things. And that's an opportunity to make progress socially, right? But we also have to think, what are the values that we want to make progress in? How do we build those in? So I think there's this sort of constitutional notion, and actually in our working group, I think we called it constitutional architectures, right? So that you try to build things into it, but that's not sufficient, right? Because the way the system actually goes, you also have to have these kinds of regulatory feedback mechanisms, systems of judgment, communities that can change the rules of the system or influence the rules of the system. I think it's very hard to get that right from the start, and that's always a dynamic, and that's where you get these systems of power that aggregate and control how the system evolves over time, and I think that's much more difficult to deal with.
Yeah, I would say that actually it's almost already in the white paper of Bitcoin what the values are, what the motivations are, and what is reflected in the technology, like the decentralization as overarching feature, so to say, is of course a very clear statement, I think, in maybe not in a moral sense, but in an ethical sense, I hope, maybe. And the privacy that you just talked about, that is kind of baked into the fabric of the first blockchain, let's say, Bitcoin, where, especially if you come to the problems of KYC and anti-money laundering, where you find a situation where technically you have the part of identity that is there for having agency, for authorizing something, strengthened to the degree that you can discard the second part that is usually part of transactions in our society that makes you traceable and that makes you responsible for what you did fall away. And that is a pretty strong technical statement, and maybe not in the moral field, but in the ethics field, about what you value.
Say the one other sort of property that's kind of related to some of these, but not quite the same, is, I guess, what you could call user sovereignty. So the idea that an individual is actually in control of their own identity. You have the private key. You decide what to do with it, and it's not really sort of administered by anyone else.
I see it a little bit differently. So I see lots of values and lots of assumptions with the designers of this technology. But what it leads to a lot of the time is, trust in computationally mediated interactions, relationships, and that, I can understand that from a technologist point of view, especially sort of a libertarian technologist point of view, that you don't trust the corruption of governments or the, banks causing crashes, and that you therefore you understand computers and you want them to have a more powerful role in what you do, but what you don't program in is things like decentralization, which leads to self-organization, more power to individuals, which it shifts power from the institutions that we have, and that's probably also the reason why we have all these banks and regulators here these few days, because they feel quite threatened, I guess, by where this technology is taking us. Also, things like transparency, we spoke about it. It's not going to solve everything. It's a great value, but I think some technologists put too much emphasis and too much trust into technology to solve social problems. And I don't think that the blockchain is going to be the killer app for all of society's problems. No one said that, by the way. But I think that's where ethics is really important, that if it's not going to solve everything magically, but it's going to cause a lot of power shifts, we should think about it very carefully on the regulatory level, but also on the developer level.
And so, so if we actually want to encode what our current social values are, or our current ethical values into the technology, it feels that there is kind of like a difficulty that comes in when we actually have those more flexible or ambiguous values, such as, for instance, fairness or justice or things like this, which oftentimes they are pretty much impossible to encode into a technological framework. And as we design technological frameworks to which we delegate our action, or that are taking control over the way in which we can operate, then from a technological perspective, it seems that there is this tension between our current value system, which is composed of often also contradictory visions, so kind of like related to the acoustic distinction. So we have values that are not necessarily always in line, because it depends on when you want to apply which one, or they have to be appreciated according to the fact of the cases. And so if we understand that we have this variety of values, and that those values are extremely difficult to encode into a technology, then what are for the developer, like how do we actually have to design this technology in order to actually leave room for those more human level of appreciation in order to decide when something should happen or not, as opposed to this smart contractual enforcement or self-execution of things?
Well, I mean, the kind of obvious answer is that you can build clauses into smart contracts to say, if all the parties or a majority of the parties that are party of the smart contract agree, then we will just move to this arbiter or this external party where who will just determine what happens. And I think that that's something that will be definitely in practice, because like you say, there's going to be lots of cases where the intended outcome isn't what ends up happening, and people will suffer damages, and then they'll just learn, okay, we just have to have X clauses.
Another point to keep in mind, I think that probably has been really underemphasized, is that even if smart contracts exist, law still exists as well, and that fact kind of to some degree, I would say, even negates some of the sort of supposedly sort of perfectly rigid properties of smart contracts. So just to give a practical example, even from outside of sort of smart contracts proper. So in the real world, you can model, let's say take an agreement like renting a house from some landlord. Now, you can model that as being a combination of a legal contract and a smart contract imposed by the laws of physics, because the laws of physics say that if you have the key that's meant to open the lock for a particular house, then you can open it. Otherwise, it's a bit harder to open it. So, theoretically, that is a kind of self-enforcing contract, because the landlord physically gives the key to the tenant, and the tenant can now open the locks. But the tenant still could actually, change the locks and stop paying the rent and just try to keep the house for themselves. But that would be illegal, and so the landlord still has the option to go to court and sue and basically try to get the house back. And in smart contract scenarios, that sort of basically using the legal system to reverse things after the fact is an option that's always available.
Yeah, but that's Peter had this example about weapon systems and cars, and the damage that you can do if something goes wrong. And actually, and as Ethereum exists today, not so many things per second can go wrong, but if it's a scale, and if it's used on a level of Internet of Things, then all of a sudden you can have cascading effects that you will have a very hard time to undo, because there's only so much damage you can repair if something really goes wrong. So yes, I completely agreed. The law doesn't disappear just because there are smart contracts. But what do you do if you have a chain effect and things just get out of hand that you cannot possibly remedy them?
That sounds like something that would be a bit hard to answer without specific examples of what kind of cascading chain effects you're talking about. Because we were talking a bit about financial systemic risks, I think, like earlier today and yesterday, but it's probably going to depend a lot on the specific case.
Yeah, right. But I mean, if you want, let's not look at a house, but that is transferred ownership. But let's keep with the door lock. This is in effect the thing that can go wrong. Somebody programs a door lock, and then a condition is triggered that opens all door locks of our houses, and they're all burgled. Then how do you revert that mistake that shouldn't have happened, or even if it was illegal to unlock that door lock?
And that sounds like technology breaking, and technology having risks of breaking is something that's inevitable, and I think not at all a special feature of technologies that are decentralized.
No, you're inserting that now. I mean, I'm not talking about a bug, but I'm talking about an unforeseen thing that is illegal, that's been programmed in, that maybe everybody looked at, but still, in the end, going against the law.
And I guess the kind of natural question is, who could be held liable? And is it the person who developed the code? Is it the people who used it? And this is a kind of question that comes up pretty often when we talk about damages that are caused due to the logic of smart contracts.
I think that thinking or talking about analogies isn't that useful in understanding the ethics of particular technologies. So all sorts of applications that are built on the blockchain will operate within a certain context, a social context, be it banking, be it in a particular country or whatever. So what you can do there is you can understand what the context is in which it's going to operate and what the values are there. And then you can start thinking about justice and fairness and all these high-level ethical principles and see how they operate in that particular context. And then as a developer, you should probably talk to people from that context, the lawyers, the ethicists, the stakeholders, people who are being affected. Talk about how you're designing that technology to achieve certain things. Show them understand the issues that are going to be arising from your design choices, mitigate them, and iterate the discussion. Go back, say we've tried to solve this particular issue by adding encryption here, for example. What do you think? And then other stakeholders may say that that's going to bring up all these other different problems. So there's this whole ethics methodology, and I think. What I see often is this talk in analogies, and it's helpful to a certain extent, but it stops being helpful quite quickly.
And I guess I would just add, I mean, these are very different kinds of problems, right? So there's a kind of catastrophic risk, right? Which I think is probably something more like a flash crash in the stock market is what you would see in these kinds of, if the whole contracting system suddenly collapsed or a currency collapsed, that would have real economic damage for a large swath of people, but it's probably not going to be like everybody getting locked out of their homes or all the homes getting burgled. I mean, even if you embedded these systems, like maybe all the bike shares are locked and nobody can like borrow a bike for the day or something. But those systems are also sort of rollbackable. You can, I mean, that's what they did in the whole stock market during the flash crash in 2010. They actually just rolled back all the trading for a few hours of trades to recover the third of the wealth of the stock market. But then you have these others, I think, more insidious kinds of problems, which is corruption or tyranny, where there's a systematic ways in which people are being exploited, or systems of power are being redistributed, or right. And those are the things where you have to sort of think, well, what can we do about that? And it's usually on an individual case or something on a more systematic case that doesn't break the whole system, but the system starts working for ends that are not the social ends.
Yeah, so another thing that I think is you often encounter in, at least in the blockchain space, but I think more generally in the context of developers, is this kind of excuse or this justification of like building a general purpose technology, which kind of means that the developers are delegating the responsibility of actually thinking of what is the potential impact or consequence of the technology on society. And So I think the blockchain is kind of like, I mean, Ethereum is of course a general purpose blockchain, but it has also, in spite of the fact that anyone can develop any kind of application on top of it, it also comes with specific architecture which will have an impact. So then my question now will be, can we actually can we actually try and stop for a moment and use the general purpose excuse, but actually look at the technology and think, what are technologically speaking, what can we actually do, or what kind of features can we implement into this technology in order to ensure that it will be used, or that in order to make it harder to take this technology and actually co-opt it in order to promote specific usages. So in the same way as we can say that the internet is a general purpose technology and can be used to promote freedom of expression, political autonomy, etc. But on the other hand, it can also be used by government and business in order to create like surveillance and control. What is it that we can do from a technological perspective to try and promote one usage of the technology as opposed to the other, without nonetheless killing the general purposeness of this technology?
I'd like to add something to that quickly. So when you talk about general purpose technology, if you look at the blockchain, it's being developed in Western countries, more or less, I'd say. So this society has a certain effect on how that technology is being programmed. And decentralization, disintermediation, they're not huge issues in liberal democracies. However, if you then implement that technology in a centrally, authoritarianly planned economy, I'm not going to name any countries, but then it's going to have a much bigger impact. Then it's not just a general purpose thing. Then it undermines state authority. So I think it's you got to be careful when you say something is general purpose or not. But I don't know about the technical mitigations.
I mean, yeah, so the problem with general purpose technologies is that sort of the range of parameters that you can choose is definitely sort of much smaller than the range of things that people can use it for. And so expressing complex preferences in an architecture choice is hard. So, for example, if I decide that I really like cats, then it's very hard to come up with some kind of modification to Ethereum that would make it promote cats better, because, blockchains honestly really can't tell the difference between cats and dogs that well. Well, except for Dogecoin. So you do have this sort of, you do have finer group, so you do have a few dimensions that you can work with. So, you do have issues of sort of, how the consensus algorithm works. Are you trying, do you promote more decentralization at the expense of, let's say, higher costs? Do you not take that choice? So it's definitely interesting how each one of those kind of relates to the different values that you have, although in some cases the links are probably sort of distant and even unpredictable, and probably have to think quite a bit about them.
Yeah. I think there's like one main thing that we can do to make sure that things kind of turn out better, and it's not a decision about at the low level of the protocol about changing the general purposeness of it and restricting it to only good things. It's more like trying to make sure that the applications that end up having network effects, end up being deployed and promoted, are ones that have are like the better option. Like, for example, Augur, which is a prediction market that has gotten the most press right now, they have an option for the oracles to say, I think this prediction market is unethical, and therefore the market will be resolved in this kind of way that says, oh, the money gets returned, the market maker loses their money because the oracle said that it was unethical. So they could have built a prediction market without that option, but the fact that they're kind of broadly the prediction market with the most appeal because of they have done the most promotion, they're probably going to have more users, and so and like markets have network effects. So the main thing that we can do is try to make sure that the things that we adopt as we like build and promote applications are the ones that have kind of that make ethical choices.
But what you're talking about here is a feature of the actual implementation of an actual application on top of Ethereum. You're not talking about Ethereum again, so the request to put aside the general purpose excuse is not addressed by that, I guess.
Well, and I don't even know if it's just the general purpose, but the architecture that you're implementing and the extent to which it's revisable and who has the authority or power to revise it, right? And this is a big issue with Bitcoin and whether you're going to have hard forks or soft forks and how that sort of mechanism functions. And I think it's ultimately, there's a trade-off. So you think you know best how the system should be architected, but then when it's actually out there working, the reality sets in of how that functions and who then has the power to decide how it gets revised and what direction it gets revised in.
Well, so I would like to just give an example just to maybe explain better my question. So Ethereum as a general purpose platform does not have to change the function of it. But for instance, when we were discussing about the question of pedophilia, Ethereum could implement, for instance, this mechanism of garbage collection so that if anyone uploads content that is not appreciated by the community, it can actually be taken down. But on the other hand, so this is, for instance, incorporating some kind of value within the design of a general purpose platform. Now, the collateral of this, of course, is that then you lose the censorship resistance value within the technology.
There's also intermediate routes, like, for example, trying to come up with some system where individual nodes can have the freedom not to store or process particular parts of the state and still sort of serve as fully functional nodes.
Yeah, and so basically there are many features that will not actually affect the fact that you're general purpose, but that can affect whether people are free to express themselves. Perhaps now I need to pay in order to actually maintain my content on the blockchain. So only people that actually have a lot of money will pay and will not be garbage collected. So all those features are actually really important, even though doesn't mean that we need to choose what the technology will be used for, but it will actually dictate what kind of use can be made of it.
But there's the things technology can do, and then there's the things that it can't do or we haven't figured out how to get it to do, right? So the government wants a backdoor on encryption technology so it can just go after bad guys, but we don't know of a kind of encryption technology that we could give them a backdoor without compromising the entire structure of the cryptography, right? So that's not a technical capability that we have. So might be a good option if we had it, but so we can try to invent it, but until we have it, we're sort of stuck with trying to make do with what we have, right?
No, maybe KMYC again is a good example. I mean, we are having in this workshops going in parallel to the ethics effort. We were talking about AML and KYC, anti-money laundering, and know your customer regulations, where, for example, FinCEN would have been very happy if a identifying tag could be programmed into the fabric of Bitcoin. And that, of course, would be a change, and that would facilitate certain things, and there are opinions about whether that's a good idea or not. And that's something that would be a change on a very low level in the fabric that would enable certain things. What I'm not sure about is then you would have to have, you already would have had to have an opinion how important AML KYC is, as opposed to privacy, to then make a judgment about whether that's ethical or not.
It's actually an important point, because it's like in some of the discussions we have here, the ethical concerns tends to sort of lean more in the direction of, well, what happens if these systems become too crypto-anarchic? Whereas I was reading this paper, I think 2 or 3 days ago, by some cryptographer that was sort of doing the same, basically making some similar arguments, and that he was sort of imploring other cryptographers to think more about ethics and not just see themselves as kind of truly, like, completely neutral people who are just doing cool math. And interestingly enough, that paper was actually criticizing mainstream cryptographers basically for not being crypto-anarchic enough, and for building systems that would then end up being sort of co-opted by centralized institutions to create systems of surveillance. So it's don't think we're not ever going to come to a consensus on exactly what ethical values we should promote.
I think that's a good point about, I mean, how do you proceed in designing these technologies? Who's participating? Whose voices are heard? What values are being built in? And how do we come to those values? Is it just the technologists who are building it who have to think about this, or how do they reach out? And I think meetings like this are designed to get these perspectives involved in that process.
Yes, so as I was learning about blockchains, I read a lot about Bitcoin, and I was a bit pessimistic because it didn't quite seem sustainable and inequalities are being created. Meaning you guys, I'm far more optimistic because you've opened yourself up to ethics discussions. You've admitted that you don't understand everything. But what I'd like to see from you guys is to take this to your community and actively maybe even support the work on some ethical guidelines or something for your community. Something that actually stimulates thought with the hundreds of engineers working on this who aren't here and who haven't had this type of input that we've had over the last few days.
And so as the last question, just because we are very lucky to have two of the Ethereum developers here, what are actually your own vision of, like, when you invented or designed Ethereum, what are the values that you tried to encode into it?
It's honestly, Ethereum wasn't nearly as sort of, I guess, intelligently designed as that question implies. Because before I was working on Ethereum, I had just sort of randomly come upon this project called Mastercoin, which is focusing on basically financial derivatives on top of Ethereum. And then I just realized that, hey, you could make this whole thing much simpler if you just replace 10 of the features with a programming language. And then people started realizing that people can do a whole bunch of other stuff that that doesn't even involve financial contracts at all. And it kind of went from there. So it's kind of an important lesson, I think, in that with a lot of these technologies, you just have such a weak ability to predict what they're going to be used for, after you start thinking of them for the first time.
Yeah, I mean, embarrassingly, I was a Bitcoiner, but I also had this other religion, which was general purposeness. So I found out about Ethereum, and that was really exciting. I guess I just wanted to decentralize the world. Yeah.
Thank you.
So that's it. We're going to the second half of the panel.
Second half.